The Pharisees, ʻfærə́siːz, were at various times a political party, a social movement, and a school of thought in the Holy Land during the time of Second Temple Judaism. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Pharisaic beliefs became the foundational, liturgical and ritualistic basis for Rabbinic Judaism. Conflicts between Pharisees and Sadducees took place in the context of much broader and long-standing social and religious conflicts among Jews, made worse by the Roman conquest. Another conflict was cultural, between those who favored Hellenization and those who resisted it. A third was juridico-religious, between those who emphasized the importance of the Second Temple with its rites and services, and those who emphasized the importance of other Mosaic laws. A fourth point of conflict, specifically religious, involved different interpretations of the Torah and how to apply it to current Jewish life, with Sadducees recognizing only the written Torah and rejecting doctrines such as the oral Torah, the prophets, the writings, and the resurrection of the dead. Josephus, a Pharisee, estimated the total Pharisee population before the fall of the Second Temple to be around 6,000. Josephus claimed that Pharisees received the full support and goodwill of the common people, apparently in contrast to the more elite Sadducees, who were the upper class. Pharisees claimed Mosaic authority for their interpretation of Jewish laws, while Sadducees represented the authority of the priestly privileges and prerogatives established since the days of Solomon, when Zadok, their ancestor, officiated as high priest. The phrase common people in Josephus's writings suggests that most Jews were just Jewish people, distinguishing them from the main liturgical groups. Outside of Jewish history and literature, Pharisees have been made notable by references in the New Testament to conflicts with John the Baptist and with Jesus. There are also several references in the New Testament to the Apostle Paul being a Pharisee. The relationship between early Christianity and Pharisees was not always hostile, however. E.g., Gamaliel is often cited as a Pharisaic leader who was sympathetic to Christians. Etymology. Pharisee is derived from ancient Greek pharisaios, from Aramaic parisa, plural parasiia, meaning set apart, separated, related to Hebrew paris, plural parasm, the passive participle of the verb paras. History. The deportation and exile of an unknown number of Jews of the ancient kingdom of Judah to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar II, starting with the first deportation in 597 BCE and continuing after the fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the Temple in 587 BCE, resulted in dramatic changes to Jewish culture and religion. During the 70-year exile in Babylon, Jewish houses of assembly and houses of prayer were the primary meeting places for prayer, and the house of study was the counterpart from the synagogue. In 539 BCE the Persians conquered Babylon, and in 537 BCE Cyrus the Great allowed Jews to return to Judea and rebuild the temple. He did not, however, allow the restoration of the Judean monarchy, which left the Judean priests as the dominant authority. Without the constraining power of the monarchy, the authority of the temple in civic life was amplified. It was around this time that the Sadducee party emerged as the party of priests and allied elites. However, the Second Temple, which was completed in 515 BCE, had been constructed under the auspices of a foreign power, and there were lingering questions about its legitimacy. This provided the condition for the development of various sects or schools of thought, each of which claimed exclusive authority to represent Judaism, and which typically shunned social intercourse, especially marriage, with members of other sects. In the same period, the Council of Sages known as the Sanhedrin may have codified and canonized the Hebrew Bible, from which Following the return from Babylon, the Torah was read publicly on market days. The temple was no longer the only institution for Jewish religious life. After the building of the Second Temple in the time of Ezra the scribe, the houses of study and worship remained important secondary institutions in Jewish life. Outside of Judea, the synagogue was often called a house of prayer. While most Jews could not regularly attend the temple service, they could meet at the synagogue for morning, afternoon and evening prayers. On Mondays, Thursdays and Shabbats, a weekly Torah portion was read publicly in the synagogues, following the tradition of public Torah readings instituted by Ezra. Although priests controlled the rituals of the temple, the scribes and sages, later called rabbis, dominated the study of the Torah. These sages maintained an oral tradition that they believed had originated at Mount Sinai alongside the Torah of Moses, a God-given interpretation of the Torah. The Hellenistic period of Jewish history began when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 332 BCE. The rift between the priests and the sages developed during this time, when Jews faced new political and cultural struggles. After Alexander's death in 323 BCE, Judea was ruled by the Egyptian Hellenic Ptolemies until 198 BCE, when the Syrian Hellenic Seleucid Empire, under Antiochus III, seized control. Then, in 167 BCE, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV invaded Judea, entered the temple, and stripped it of money and ceremonial objects. He imposed a program of forced Hellenization, requiring Jews to abandon their own laws and customs, thus precipitating the Maccabean revolt. Jerusalem was liberated in 165 BCE and the temple was restored. In 141 BCE, an assembly of priests and others affirmed Simon Maccabeus as high priest and leader, in effect establishing the Hasmonean dynasty. The Hasmonean period. Although the Pharisees did not support the wars of expansion of the Hasmoneans and the forced conversions of the Idumeans, the political rift between them became wider when a Pharisee named Eleazar insulted the Hasmonean ethnarch John Hyrcanus at his own table, suggesting that he should abandon his role as high priest due to a rumor, probably untrue, that he had been conceived while his mother was a prisoner of war. In response, he distanced himself from the Pharisees. After the death of John Hyrcanus, his younger son Alexander Jannaeus made himself king and openly sided with the Sadducees by adopting the rites in the temple. His actions caused a riot in the temple and led to a brief civil war that ended with a bloody repression of the Pharisees. However, on his deathbed, Jannaeus advised his widow, Salome Alexandra, to seek reconciliation with the Pharisees. Her brother was Shimon ben Shetach, a leading Pharisee. Josephus attests that Salome was favorably inclined toward the Pharisees, and the political influence grew tremendously under her reign, especially in the Sanhedrin, a Jewish council, which they came to dominate. After her death, her elder son Hyrcanus, who was generally supported by the Sadducees, her younger son, Aristobulus too, was in conflict with Hyrcanus, and tried to seize power. The Pharisees seemed to be in a vulnerable position at this time. The conflict between the two sons culminated in a civil war that ended when the Roman general Pompey intervened and captured Jerusalem in 63 BCE. There are some reasons to think that Josephus's account overstates the role of the Pharisees. He reports elsewhere that the Pharisees did not grow to power until the reign of Queen Salome Alexandra. As Josephus was himself a Pharisee, his account might represent a historical creation meant to elevate the status of the Pharisees during the height of the Hasmonean dynasty. Later texts like the Mishnah and the Talmud record a host of rulings by rabbis, some of whom are believed to be from among the Pharisees, concerning sacrifices and other ritual practices in the temple, torts, criminal law, and governance. In the day The influence of the Pharisees over the lives of the common people was strong, and the rulings on Jewish law were deemed authoritative by many. The Roman period. According to Josephus, the Pharisees appeared before Pompey asking him to interfere and restore the old priesthood while abolishing the royalty of the Hasmoneans. Altogether, Pharisees also opened Jerusalem's gates to the Romans, and actively supported them against the Sadducean faction. When the Romans finally broke the entrance to the Jerusalem's temple, the Pharisees killed the priests who were officiating the temple services on Saturday. They regarded Pompey's defilement of the temple in Jerusalem as a divine punishment of Sadducean misrule. Pompey ended the monarchy in 63 BCE and named Hyrcanus II high priest and ethnarch. 6 years later, Hyrcanus was deprived of the remainder of political authority, and ultimate jurisdiction was given to the proconsul of Syria, who ruled through Hyrcanus's Idumean associate Antipater, and later Antipater's two sons Phasael and Herod. In 40 BCE, Aristobulus's son Antigonus overthrew Hyrcanus and named himself king and high priest, and Herod fled to Rome. In Rome, Herod sought the support of Mark Antony and Octavian, and secured recognition by the Roman Senate as king, confirming the termination of the Hasmonean dynasty. According to Josephus, Sadducean opposition to Herod led him to treat the Pharisees favorably. Herod was an unpopular ruler, perceived as a Roman puppet. Despite his restoration and expansion of the Second Temple, Herod's notorious treatment of his own family and of the last Hasmoneans further eroded his popularity. According to Josephus, the Pharisees ultimately opposed him and thus fell victims to his bloodthirstiness. The family of Boethus, whom Herod had raised to the high priesthood, revived the spirit of the Sadducees, and thenceforth the Pharisees again had them as antagonists. While it stood, the Second Temple remained the center of Jewish ritual life. According to the Torah, Jews were required to travel to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices at the temple 3 times a year: Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The Pharisees, like the Sadducees, were politically quiescent, and studied, taught, and worshipped in their own way. At this time, serious theological differences emerged between the Sadducees and Pharisees. The notion that the sacred could exist outside of the temple, a view central to the ascens, was shared and elevated by the Pharisees. The Pharisaic Legacy. At first, the values of the Pharisees developed through the sectarian debates with the Sadducees. Then they developed through internal, non-sectarian debates over the law as an adaptation to life without the temple, and life in exile, and eventually, to a more limited degree, life in conflict with Christianity. These shifts mark the transformation of Pharisaic to Rabbinic Judaism beliefs. No single tractate of the key rabbinic texts, the Mishnah and the Talmud, is devoted to theological issues. These texts are concerned primarily with interpretations of Jewish law, and anecdotes about the sages and the values. Only one chapter of the Mishnah deals with theological issues. It asserts that 3 kinds of people will have no share in the world to come: those who deny the resurrection of the dead, those who deny the divinity of the Torah, and Epicureans. Another passage suggests a different set of core principles. Normally, a Jew may violate any law to save a life, but in Sanhedrin 74a, a ruling orders Jews to accept martyrdom rather than violate the laws against idolatry, murder, or adultery. In comparison with Christianity, the rabbis were not especially concerned with the Messiah claims about the Messiah ranking the laws in importance. Monotheism. One belief central to the Pharisees was shared by all Jews of the time is monotheism. This is evident in the practice of reciting the Shema, a prayer composed of select verses from the Torah. At the temple and in synagogues, the Shema begins with the verses, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." Quote, according to the Mishnah, these passages were recited in the temple along with the twice-daily Tamid offering. Jews in the diaspora, who did not have access to the temple, recited these passages in the houses of assembly. According to the Mishnah and Talmud, the men of the Great Assembly instituted the requirement that Jews both in Judea and in the diaspora pray 3 times a day, and include in the prayers a recitation of these passages in the morning and evening prayers. Wisdom. Pharisaic wisdom was compiled in one book of the Mishnah, ʻfærə́siːz. The Pharisaic attitude is perhaps best exemplified by a story about the sages Hillel the Elder and Shammai, who both lived in the latter half of the 1st century BCE. A Gentile once challenged Shammai to teach him the wisdom of the Torah while he stood on one foot. Shammai drove him away. The same Gentile approached Hillel and asked of him the same thing. Hillel chastised him gently by saying, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow." That is the whole Torah. The rest is the explanation. Now go and study. Free will in predestination, according to Josephus. Whereas the Sadducees believed that people have total free will and the Ascents believed that all of a person's life is predestined, the Pharisees believed that people have free will but that God also has foreknowledge of human destiny. This also accords with the statement in ʻfærə́siːz 3:19, Rabbi Akiva said, "All is foreseen, but freedom of choice is given." According to Josephus, Pharisees were further distinguished from the Sadducees in that Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, the afterlife, unlike the Sadducees, who are generally held to have rejected any existence after death. The sources vary on the beliefs of the Pharisees on the afterlife. According to the New Testament, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, but it does not specify whether this resurrection included the flesh or not. According to Josephus, who himself was a Pharisee, the Pharisees held that only the soul was immortal and the souls of good people would be reincarnated and pass into other bodies, while the souls of the wicked will suffer eternal punishment. Paul, who declared himself to be a Pharisee before his conversion to Christianity, may have believed in the resurrection of only a spiritualized body, denying that the resurrection included flesh and blood, practices a kingdom of priests. Fundamentally, the Pharisees continued a form of Judaism that extended beyond the temple, applying Jewish law to mundane activities in order to sanctify the everyday world. This was a more participatory form of Judaism, in which rituals were not monopolized by an inherited priesthood but rather could be performed by all adult Jews individually or collectively, whose leaders were not determined by birth but by scholarly achievement. Many, including some scholars, have characterized the Sadducees as a sect that interpreted the Torah literally, and the Pharisees as interpreting the Torah liberally. Yitzhak Isaac Halevi suggests that this was not, in fact, a matter of religion. He claims that the complete rejection of Judaism would not have been tolerated under the Hasmonean rule, and therefore Hellenists maintained that they were rejecting not Judaism but rabbinic law. Thus, the Sadducees were in fact a political party, not a religious sect. However, according to Jacob Neusner, this view is a distortion. He suggests that two things fundamentally distinguished the Pharisaic from the Sadducean approach to the Torah. First, Pharisees believed in a broad and literal interpretation of Exodus. "You shall be my own possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And the words of 2 Maccabees, God gave all the people the heritage, the kingdom, the priesthood, and the holiness. The Pharisees believed that the idea that all of the children of Israel were to be like priests was expressed elsewhere in the Torah. For example, when the law itself was transferred from the sphere of the priesthood to every man in Israel. Moreover, the Torah already provided some ways for all Jews to lead a priestly life. The precepts concerning unclean meat were perhaps intended originally for the priests, but were extended to the whole people. The prohibition of cutting the flesh in mourning for the dead. The Pharisees believed that all Jews in their ordinary life, and not just the temple priesthood, Jews visiting the temple, should observe rules and rituals concerning purification. The oral Torah. The Pharisees believed that in addition to the written Torah recognized by both the Sadducees and Pharisees and believed to have been written by God through Moses, there exists an oral Torah, consisting of the corpus of oral laws, interpretations, and traditions transmitted by God to Moses orally, and then memorized and passed down by Moses and his successors over the generations. The oral Torah functioned to elaborate and explicate what was written, and the Pharisees asserted that the sacred scriptures were not complete on their own terms and could therefore not be understood. The Pharisaic understanding claims that the written and oral Torah are not two separate entities, but one entity. The sages of the Talmud believed that the oral law was simultaneously revealed to Moses at Sinai and the product of debates among rabbis. Thus, one may conceive of the oral Torah not as a fixed text but as an ongoing process of analysis and argument in which God is actively involved. It was this ongoing process that was revealed at Sinai, and by participating in this ongoing process, rabbis and the students are actively participating in God's ongoing act of revelation. As Jacob Neusner has explained, the schools of the Pharisees and rabbis were unholy, because the men achieved sainthood through study of Torah and imitation of the conduct of the masters. In doing so, they conformed to the heavenly paradigm. The Torah believed to have been created by God in his image, revealed at Sinai, and handed down to their own teachers. If the masters and disciples obey the divine teaching of Moses, our rabbi, then the society, the school, replicates on earth the heavenly academy, just as the disciple incarnates the heavenly model of Moses, our rabbi. The rabbis believed that Moses was a rabbi, God dons phylacteries, and the heavenly court studies Torah precisely as does the earthly one, even arguing about the same questions. These beliefs today may seem as projections of rabbinical values onto heaven, but the rabbis believe that they themselves are projections of heavenly values onto earth. The rabbis thus conceive that on earth they study Torah just as God, the angels, and Moses, our rabbi, do in heaven. The heavenly school men are even aware of Babylonian scholastic discussions, so they require a rabbi's information about an aspect of purity taboos. The commitment to relate religion to daily life through the law has led some to infer that the Pharisees were more legalistic than other sects in the Second Temple era. The authors of the Gospels present Jesus as speaking harshly against them Pharisees. It is more accurate to say they were legalistic in a different way. In some cases, Pharisaic values led to an extension of the law. For example, the Torah requires priests to bathe themselves before entering the temple. The Pharisees washed themselves before Sabbath and festival meals, and eventually before all meals. Although this seems burdensome compared to the practices of the Sadducees, in other cases, Pharisaic law was less strict. For example, Jewish law prohibits Jews from carrying objects from a private domain to a public domain on Sabbath. This law could have prevented Jews from carrying cooked dishes to the homes of friends for Sabbath meals. The Pharisees ruled that adjacent houses connected by lintels or fences could become connected by a legal procedure, creating a partnership among homeowners, thereby clarifying the status of those common areas as a private domain relative to the members of the partnership. In that manner, people could carry objects from building to building. Innovators are preservers. The Mishnah in the beginning of Avot and Maimonides in his introduction to Mishnah Torah records a chain of tradition from Moses at Mount Sinai, down to Rashi, redactor of the Talmud and last of the Amorim. This chain of tradition includes the interpretation of unclear statements in the Bible, the methods of textual exegesis, and laws with Mosaic authority that cannot be derived from the biblical text, the amount and order of the scrolls to be placed in the phylacteries, etc. Closing parenthesis. The Pharisees were also innovators in that they enacted specific laws as they saw necessarily according to the needs of the time. These included prohibitions to prevent an infringement of a biblical prohibition called gezerot, among others. The commandment to read the Megillah on Purim and to light the menorah on Hanukkah are rabbinic innovations. Much of the legal system is based on what the sages constructed via logical reasoning and from established practice. Also, the blessings before meals and the wording of the Amidah. These are known as takanot. The Pharisees based their authority to innovate on the verses, according to the word they tell you, according to all they instruct you, according to the law they instruct you, and according to the judgment they say to you, you shall do. You shall not divert from the word they tell you, either right or left. In an interesting twist, Abraham Geiger posits that the Sadducees were the more hidebound adherents to an ancient halacha, whereas the Pharisees were more willing to develop halacha as the times required. See, however, Bernard Revel's Karaite halacha, which rejects many of Geiger's proofs. Significance of debate and study of the law. Just as important as any particular law was the value the rabbis placed on legal study and debate. The sages of the Talmud believed that when they taught the oral Torah to the students, they were imitating Moses, who taught the law to the children of Israel. Moreover, the rabbis believed that the heavenly court studies Torah precisely as does the earthly one, even arguing about the same questions. Thus, in debating and disagreeing over the meaning of the Torah or how best to put it into practice, no rabbi felt that he were in some way rejecting God or threatening Judaism. On the contrary, it was precisely through such arguments that the rabbis imitated and honored God. One sign of the Pharisaic emphasis on debate and differences of opinion is that the Mishnah and Talmud mark different generations of scholars in terms of different pairs of contending schools. In the 1st century, for example, the two major Pharisaic schools were those of Hillel and Shammai. After Hillel died in 20 CE, Shammai assumed the office of president of the Sanhedrin until he died in 30 CE. Followers of these two sages dominated scholarly debate over the following decades. Although the Talmud records the arguments and positions of the school of Shammai, the teachings of the school of Hillel were ultimately taken as authoritative.